We are back on the 0 Hour. I'm your host, of course, Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us once again is economist Richard Wolff, who is the host of Economic Update every Tuesday evening on Free Speech TV. He's also the founder of Democracy at Work.info. He's an economist, a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and also a visiting professor at the New School in New York City. And I thought he would have, as always, an interesting perspective on what's going on. So once again, Richard Wolff, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Richard. Glad to be here.
Well, glad to have you, especially now that I seem to have memorized your biography, so I don't have to look at any of it on the show sheet anymore. But on more serious matters, as we record this on Thursday, we've now seen a week of serious, I would say, physical conflict on the streets of our cities. We've seen, first of all, more than a week ago, we had the killing, of course, of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the protests around that, the violent police reaction to the protests, some looting and so on. The last time you and I talked, which was just a couple weeks ago, we talked about the idea that the present system, economic, political, and so on, is unstable, basically, and can't last much longer. Do you view this as an isolated series of events, or perhaps as evidence of that unraveling taking place?
I think it's evidence. I think it's the opening, pardon my metaphor, the opening gun to what we're going to be seeing much more of it, with this qualification. If there is a mass movement from below, organized probably by labor union and left-wing political forces, if they can organize quickly, mobilize their people, and work in a coordinated way, then what I'm about to say might be averted. But in the absence of that, and I must say I don't see it emerging at this moment anyway, then I think we're in for more and more. And there's a basic reason for it that really cannot be overstated. When you throw 42 million people, and that's the official count, out of work over the last, let's say, 10 weeks, you are declaring, whether you intend it or not, really is irrelevant. You are declaring class war against the 160 million people in the United States labor force. And let me explain why. First of all, 42 million, that's more than a quarter of the labor force in this country. So however you quarrel about the details, we're talking at least a 25% level of unemployment, and that equals the worst level that unemployment reached in the Great Depression, namely in the year 1933. So we are at, and in all likelihood, likely to exceed, that level of unemployment, which would qualify what we're going through as the worst crisis of capitalism in the history of the United States. It remains to be seen whether the capitalisms in other parts of the world follow suit. All right, here's what that means. For that 25%, 1/4, and let's be clear, if 1/4 of the workers of the country are out of work, there will be almost no family that isn't touched by this. Mother or father, but also son or daughter, or cousin, or uncle, or aunt, or grandma. Someone's unemployed in virtually every family, in many more than one. Those people have diminished incomes. Those people have diminished self-esteem. Those people need to lean on borrow from their fellow family members. It is therefore crunch time for all of them, one way or another, more or less. Then there's the uncertainty, which can be as destructive as anything else I've said. Here's the uncertainty. You don't know whether the job you lost because of the pandemic, will be there when you get ready to go back to work. Your employer doesn't know either. Many variables will determine it, but you certainly have to be uncertain and anxiety-ridden about whether you'll have a job to go back to, and that only makes your unemployment worse. But let me turn next to the 3/4 of the labor force, roughly 120 million Americans, who are still working, who have a job. When I said class war, I meant they are the victims or about to become the victims of that class war. And here's why. When you have massive unemployment, it acts economically like an invitation to every employer, large, medium, and small, to take advantage of the unemployment, to go to the workers you are still employing and say to them, look, John, look, Mary, I've been having a hard time. The pandemic has hurt our business, right. The economic crash even more so. I'm very sorry, but you're going to have to take a wage cut of 20%. You're going to have to lose your pension. You're going to have to take fewer holidays. You're going to have to come in a half hour early. You're going to have to stay a little bit longer. I'm going to have to cut your lunch hour. You get the picture. And the employer does this because he can. And why can he? Because there's 42 million unemployed people. If the existing worker doesn't accept reduced wages, reduced benefits, worse working conditions, or whatever, then there's 42 million people unemployed, having a harder time with each passing week as they use up their savings, they use up the toleration of the people they share households with, etc., desperate, who will take the job at the reduced wage and the reduced benefits. You're going to see that happening in the months and years again, across the board. That's why I call this a class war. It's a wholesale attack on the standard of living, the standard of consumption, the standard of work of the entire American working class. And in case you're wondering, well, gee, my employer is a nice person, he or she won't do it. Even if that were true, the competitors of your employer will do it, and that will sooner or later force your employer to do it too. Competition, which is that thing we celebrate on the 4th of July and every president bows down to, competition in this case drives the employer to screw his or her employees, whether or not he or she wishes to treat employees that way. That's why I call it a class war. It's not about the particular employer, this one or that one. This is a wholesale attack, this unemployment of 42 million people, because it not only damages, in the way I explained, the people who are unemployed, their families, their innocent children, and all the rest, but for all of the workers still employed, it is an invitation to the employer to lower your wages, cut your benefits, make your job situation much worse, because if you quit, there's those 42 million unemployed becoming more desperate by the day, and they will take your job, which means we are in a moment in which the entire employee class of the United States, everyone below, the chief executive and the few folks at the top who get the big bucks, all the rest of us are now in a dangerous time of attack on our economics. This has nothing to do with the pandemic. Nothing. This is about how the economic system works. And to finally make that point, let me compare what the Germans and the French, capitalist countries like America, have done. They did not throw millions of people out of work. They do not have 25% unemployment. Unemployment in Germany right now is 6%, just to give you an idea. They are helping their working class by paying them wages while they stay out of work. That way they keep their job. The employer cannot fire them, neither now nor when the pandemic is considered to be over. They continue to get paid, I believe, in the neighborhood of 70 to 80% of what they were getting paid, and they keep their job. So the employer cannot go to existing people and threaten them that there are all these other unemployed out there. They're not there. That's a radically different way of dealing with it. And to answer RJ's question, it shows you what alternatives there are. In France and Germany, there are powerful socialist political parties. There are powerful further left anti-capitalist parties. They're even called that in France. In Germany, they're called the Left Party. The strength politically, ideologically, culturally of socialism and Marxism and leftism and labor unionism, those things are so strong that even a government run by conservatives, which is what you basically have in France and Germany, dares not do what the employer class leadership, and I mean by that Mr. Trump, is prepared to do and is doing. And the worst of it all, I read this morning that the United States Congress, which I apparently gather is both the Republican leadership in the Senate and the Democratic leadership in the House, are considering a bill, I kid you not, that will bribe American workers, desperate with their unemployment, to go back into what remain unsafe workplaces by giving them a quote-unquote bonus for returning to work, splitting the unemployed between those not ready to go into a workplace where they can get sick and infect their families versus the other ones who are so desperate that even though less than 5% of Americans have been tested for the coronavirus, meaning that if you go back to work in a store, a factory, or an office, you are going to be surrounded by people who may have no symptoms. But until we test them, they may in fact be ill and you at risk. These are behaviors of a disrespect and a horrible attitude towards the working class, which is the majority, that is going to be a hallmark of one of the worst periods in American history. And therefore, yes, you can expect much more in the way of protest.
Well, Richard Wolff, let's talk about the racial aspect of this for a second and the structural racism aspect of it. I haven't seen the latest figures, but in recent years, African-American unemployment has been roughly double that of white unemployment. So if we have 25% of the labor force unemployed, it's probably, I mean, I don't know this to be a fact, but I would assume it would be significantly higher than that for Black Americans. And if that's the case, then everything you describe would be that much worse in our African American communities and in communities of color in general. So I don't know how that plays out specifically in this case, but people who are forced into overcrowded living conditions by disparities in housing, who don't have access to decent education, who don't have access to adequate health care, whose physical environment is unsafe and environmentally polluted. You're talking about a situation that's desperate for everyone. and reaches extreme levels for Black communities. And I don't know if I'm interpreting the facts correctly or not in terms of unemployment and so on, but we know the poverty is higher in Black communities and so on. We know the health is worse. I would think that, therefore, it should not be surprising if this social unrest continues to arise first in Black communities. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, let me comment a little bit. You're absolutely right. Black and brown unemployment, but particularly African American unemployment, has been higher than white unemployment for at least the last 50 years. It is not a new situation. It is a sign of a racism deeply embedded in a culture that it lasts as long as it does now, number one. Number two, actually the most horrible discriminatory suffering of the African American community since the Great Recession of 2008 and 9 was the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who lost their homes through foreclosure, through having insufficient funds to maintain their mortgage payments, etc., were African Americans, which is why they are even further behind in the wealth they own relative to white people now than they were, for example, when Mr. Obama took office. He may have been the first African American who's a president, but he presided over a catastrophic loss, particularly in home ownership, among the African American community. So yes, they suffer worse. And that, of course, means that they're going to be the flashpoint. They're the people who are going to be unable to take one more day of a bad neighborhood, inadequate housing, all the things you mentioned, and quite rightly. And so they're going to be an extra difficulty for the police department. And let me make a couple of comments about that. The police here are put into an impossible situation. A pandemic that forces us to stay home is making people stir crazy, physically and mentally not all there, to be as nice about it as I can. The incompetence of this government in not preparing for it, the profit-driven mentality of companies who didn't produce the beds, the testing equipment, and all the rest that we needed. I mean, these failures of a medical sort are catastrophic. But to allow at the same time the unstable capitalist system to go through another of its every 4 to 7 year crashes at the same time, well, that takes a genius level of incompetence and failure of a systemic sort. And so people are going nuts, if you like. These are social catastrophes. To throw your army at them, whether you call it police or military, doesn't really matter, is throwing way too little, way too late. The armies and the police can repress, but they can't solve the social problem. And it's the social problem that produced the protests. Let me give an example from our history. We have been fighting now, we, the United States, in Afghanistan and in Iraq for almost 20 years. And we are further behind than when we entered. We've lost those wars. And the reason is not far to search. Every time you kill or injure or hurt an Afghani citizen or an Iraqi citizen, you may kill him or her, you may imprison them, but you know what you've done? You've created 5, 10, 15, 20 people that are close to them, their husbands, their wives, their children, their parents, who are now your sworn enemy. And as they grow older and as the bitterness settles, they will become a bigger problem. The military can't solve these problems. They often make them worse. You ought to have learned that if all you do is now throw the domestic military, who we call the police, at the people who are at the wrong short end of the straw of economic disintegration and social injustice, you're going to get the same sorry result. Afghanistan is a decimated place. So is Iraq. We're not one step further. Thousands of people have died on both sides. This is another failure. This, to quote the president, dominate them. No, no, don't be silly. You can't do that. It's a little bit like George Bush landing on that aircraft carrier and telling us all, let them come. Well, they let them come, and now the United States is negotiating with the Taliban because we can't beat them. This is the lesson that the British Empire learned when the United States had a revolutionary war of independence. These are issues that you cannot rhetorically dismiss. When Mr. Trump sends in the military to try to control the disaster his government and his system have produced, he is not only not learning the lesson of history, but as we have been warned, he is now condemning all of us to repeat those lessons, and they will be bitter, and they will involve more protests, more hopeless violence against the protester, and more people inspired by police violence to join the protesters.
And by the way, Richard Wolff, as you were talking, a military helicopter flew over my house here in Greater Washington, D.C., so in the Washington, D.C. area. So as we speak, this sort of military occupation of at least this city is very much in evidence. That gets me to something I also wanted to talk with you about. I wrote a piece just came out now about the culture of white violence. And this is going back to the kind of lurid police magazines I saw as a little boy in the barber shops in the Rust Belt, and Mickey's Plane and these revenge fantasies, and then the Clint Eastwood sniper movies, and at least a white American culture that thrives on this kind of violent ethos of the man alone wreaking his terrible vengeance with a gun or a knife, which, among other things, I think scars the psyches of the white men who internalize it. But it seems to me that, we've seen some good actions from individual sheriffs and police officers and so on. But it seems to me that a lot of these officers we've seen, kicking a young woman on the ground, punching a reporter in the face, and doing worse to, black folks around the country, when video isn't or is around. It seems to me that this is another instrument of economic social control, not only for the people being punched and kicked or shot, but for the people doing the punching and the kicking and the shooting, that somehow we have a white culture, particularly, a lower income white culture, whose rage has been misdiverted to control them as well as marginalized communities. But I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, let me give you 3 statistics that I think speak volumes to what you're saying. Here's the first one. In 2019, the last full year we have statistics for, police in the United States killed 1,004 people. That's from the Washington Post and the New York Times. Over the same 1-year period, in England and Wales, the police killed 3 people. Over the same year in Denmark, the police killed no people. In Japan, they killed 8 people. In Australia, they killed 9 people. So 1,000 plus here, and basically single digits or 0 elsewhere. Something is terribly wrong here. Partly it's wrong to think you can solve your social problems by violence of this sort. But it is the way Americans have been working for a very long time. And the illusion has been cultivated that it was the violence that kept this country from blowing apart. It wasn't. It was something completely different. It was the fact that despite discrimination for at least the white part of the population, mass jobs, rising real income were the history of the country from roughly 1815 to the 1970s, which is a very long time. So you kept your social problems at bay by having at least enough of a rising tide that at least the white boats went up enough to focus people on getting a job and raising a family and not confronting their local police. But the police think, and people like them, that it was their harshness that somehow kept the lid on. That's a mistake. Number two, the 13th Amendment of the United States outlaws slavery, came right after the Civil War. But it makes an exception. Go read it sometime, the 13th Amendment. It runs a whopping 2 sentences, so it won't take you long. There's an exception. Slavery is outlawed except in jails and prisons. Turns out, if you are convicted of something, you are not in a situation that abolishes slavery. You can be treated like a slave. If you look at the jails of the United States today, the overwhelming majority of people in jail are black and brown. We have, in fact, preserved slavery and all of the horrible human relationships between master and slave that go with that system, which is why we fought a civil war to get rid of it, but we left it in our jails, and so we keep rotating a huge proportion of our African American and Latino communities through an institution that is allowed to practice slavery. And that ought to be understood rather than we pretend that it doesn't exist. And now the last of the statistics. Excuse me. The last of the statistics is this one. Last year, and it's been going on for years, more police personnel in the United States died by means of suicide than were killed by any criminal perpetrator. In other words, the greatest danger to the police is what happens to them inside by being put in a social position that they cannot handle in a humane way. So they have to become the kinds of people we see acting out deranged fantasies and killing people. The police commit suicide. They can't handle it. This is what happens when systems collapse. It's not just the people at the bottom who suffer. Lord knows they do. But a system collapse happens when most of the people in a society, one way or another, are confronted with conditions that are intolerable. One way out, you leave this world. Another way out, you protest and try to make it a better world for everybody. Police are committing suicide and making our social problems worse. Protesters are taking a much more positive approach. Thanks for them to demand the changes. One final point about the racial dimension. Yes, it's there. Of course it's there. How could talking about problems in the United States not talk about it? But the greatest danger I see right now is the desperate effort of so many people to make this a racial issue of white police against black citizens, etc. That's really the tip of the iceberg. The whole of the iceberg underneath, what makes that tip stick out is the absolute economic destruction of this society. A wild, out of control capitalism enriching the people who already are the richest. Over the last 10 weeks, in case you don't know, Jeffrey Bezos, the richest man in America, became richer by 20 to 30 billion dollars. I mean, the obscenity of that, as poor people are finding it harder and harder, as the lines in front of food kitchens at churches grow longer. This is a system that is spinning out of control, and the looting is a mere footnote, and the protests are the only hope that something will emerge here that changes this society, changes its direction, or else I fear for us all.
Well, I can't think of a more appropriate note to end on than that. I certainly hope it looks suicide is the ultimate act of despair. I certainly know about despair. Positive action to me has been the only solution to it. So I hope that as time goes on, more and more people, including people like white police officers and workers of all races and unemployed people everywhere, begin to understand that there's an alternative to despair, and that alternative is, in fact, the positive action you just described. So Richard Wolff, economist, host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. As always, great talking with you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
My pleasure, Richard, and my appreciation, as always, for producing programs like this. It's one of those things that can help, we hope, move this in a better direction.